On this Tuesday night, the Millennium Scoop class action lawsuit. The battle to compensate off-reserve Indigenous children ripped away from their families.
Every single day I had to be prepared for the worst.
The decades of harm and heartache. American election workers on the record about threats.
Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you?
Mounting evidence of Donald Trump's pressure campaign to stay in power. Federal money for mental health missing in action.
Mental health should be a priority.
Where are the billions the Trudeau Liberals promised? And the art of a tribute. Google honors an Indigenous man dubbed the Picasso of the North.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Nitu Garcha.
Indigenous heritage and traditions were on full display across the country as Canadians mark National Indigenous Peoples Day. But at a time meant to recognize and honor First Nations, Inuit and Métis cultures, members of the community are wrapping up for another legal battle against the federal government. Good evening and thanks for joining us. The Federal Court of Canada has certified a class action lawsuit against Ottawa on behalf of Indigenous children taken from their families during the so-called Millennium Scoop. They want to see a shift in the law to stop what they call federal attempts to put an end to Ottawa's obligation towards Indigenous people. Abigail Bimman has our top story tonight.
Every single day I had to be prepared for the worst.
Bouncing between 15 group homes and foster homes since the age of 8 with a literal garbage bag for her belongings, Cheyenne Stonechild is now lead representative plaintiff in a class action suit against the federal government just certified by the federal court.
There's so many kids that are lost. There's so many kids that can't be here. There's so many kids that the expectations are so high that I'm okay to do this.
The case seeks to compensate off-reserve Indigenous children in Canada's welfare system. Fewer than 10% of kids in Canada are Indigenous, according to the 2016 census, but Indigenous children and youth make up more than half of the foster system population. Children living off-reserve were not included in January's $40 billion settlement.
When you look at the reconciliation, and we should be trying to make sure that our most vulnerable are taken care of, and there is substantive equity for all our children, again, regardless of where they live.
We'll deal with it as we've dealt with several other class action suits. What's important is that justice arrives for people who went through those difficult periods.
We're hoping that the federal government, does change its tune and decides to treat off-reserve, Métis, non-status Inuit kids the same as on-reserve kids because they're just as Indigenous.
For years, Stonechild fought to find her family and has been an advocate for other Indigenous kids since. She says the certification feels like validation.
The courts, at the very least, is that there's no distinction between on and off reserve Indigenous kids.
The certification is just the beginning of this case. Lawyers say it's too early to know how much compensation they could be asking for, nor exactly how many children would be covered, but they know they number in the many thousands. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
In Washington, the committee investigating the January 6th attack focused today on Donald Trump's pressure campaign to get state officials to overturn his election loss. The committee heard Trump's own words on tape, as well as the devastating impact they had on election workers, which Trump and his allies singled out. Jackson Proskow has more.
Recounting the terrifying threats they faced, state election officials testified about the extent of Donald Trump's pressure campaign to overturn an election he'd lost, from public rallies to berating phone calls.
The real truth is I won by 400,000 votes, at least. So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
There were no votes to find. That was an accurate count that had been certified.
Trump's well-known attempt to pressure officials in Georgia to find the votes he needed was just part of it. In Arizona, state officials say Trump and his team repeatedly made wild accusations.
Did anyone provide you with evidence of election fraud sufficient to affect the outcome of the presidential election in Arizona?
No one provided me ever such evidence.
Trump and his associates pushed a scheme to select a fake slate of electors in an attempt to block certification of Joe Biden's Electoral College victory on January 6th.
And I said, look, you are asking me to do something that is counter to my oath when I swore to the Constitution to uphold it.
Even as legal challenges failed in the courts, Trump and his team pushed ahead, knowing their plan likely broke the law.
At the request of the Trump campaign, the electors from these battleground states signed documents falsely asserting that they were the, quote, duly elected electors from their state.
The scheme went so far as to send those fake electoral votes to Washington in hopes Vice President Mike Pence would consider them on the 6th. Pence refused. But Trump didn't stop there. The depth and breadth of his campaign included public attacks on 2 election workers from Georgia, a mother and daughter. Trump's team falsely alleged they stole thousands of ballots.
She's a vote scammer, a professional vote scammer and hustler.
Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you?
What's remarkable is that it was all so brazen, and as we know, so much of it is on tape. What happened in Georgia may in fact carry the most criminal liability for the former president. A grand jury is now investigating, and that's all entirely separate from the questions about Trump's role in the attack of January 6th. Neetu?
Jackson Proskow in Washington, thanks. Damning testimony today at a Texas Senate hearing into last month's mass shooting at an elementary school in Uvalde. The state's top cop says there were enough officers on scene to have stopped the gunman just minutes after he entered the building, calling the police response an abject failure.
3 minutes after the subject entered the West Building, there was a sufficient number of armed officers wearing body armor to isolate, distract, and neutralize the subject. The only thing stopping a hallway of dedicated officers from entering room 111 and 112 was the on-scene commander, who decided to place the lives of officers before the lives of children.
19 children and 2 teachers were killed as officers waited for over an hour for reinforcements and a key to the classroom. McCraw testified the classroom door was unlocked, saying there is no evidence officers ever tried to open it. Delays in the police response have become the focus of the federal, state, and local investigation of the massacre. Far to the west of Ukraine, an isolated Russian territory is fast becoming another flashpoint. While Russia continues its advance in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, the Kremlin has warned Lithuania, an EU and NATO member, there will be severe consequences if more rail shipments are blocked to Kaliningrad. As Redmond Shannon reports, the small region is not connected to mainland Russia and is already seeing the consequences of new economic sanctions.
Far from the battlefields of Ukraine, peaceful Kaliningrad could emerge as a new focal point in the war. The region has changed hands over the centuries, most recently after the Second World War, when the Soviet Union annexed it from Germany. About half the size of Vancouver Island, Kaliningrad is a Russian exclave on the Baltic Sea. Sandwiched between EU members Poland and Lithuania, it relies on Russian goods sent by rail through Belarus and Lithuania. Since new EU sanctions came into effect last Friday, its governor says 50% of imports are being blocked, including coal and construction materials. Russia's Security Council secretary visited on Tuesday, saying the consequences will have a serious negative impact on Lithuania and its people. What exactly that means for the NATO member is as yet unclear. Lithuania's Prime Minister says the situation is the result of an EU sanction and not a Lithuanian blockade. The EU's ambassador to Moscow was summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry on Tuesday.
I appealed to the Russian side to remain cool-headed, not to escalate.
But de-escalation isn't a term Vladimir Putin is using. The Russian president told military graduates that Russia's newest intercontinental nuclear missile will be in operation by the end of the year, as he outlined plans to modernize the country's armed forces. Meanwhile, the German and British governments repeated their pledges to further arm Ukraine too.
We're determined to provide more weapons, impose more sanctions and back Ukraine in pushing Russia out of their territory.
The slow and bloody fight for that territory continues from both sides in the Donbass. Ukraine says Russia has captured some territory there in recent days, but a former senior US commander says the arrival of more Western weapons could soon turn the tide in favour of Ukraine. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
A Russian journalist has sold his Nobel Peace Prize for a record-shattering amount to help children displaced by the war in Ukraine.
Is there anybody else in this room or the world outbidding $100 million on bidder 303?
Dmitry Muratov's Nobel medal ended up selling for more than $133 million Canadian to a still unidentified bidder. Muratov, who was awarded the prize in October of 2021, put it up for auction with all proceeds to go to UNICEF to support Ukrainian refugees. A treasured landmark of Hong Kong is now lying at the bottom of the sea. The city's famed jumbo floating restaurant capsized less than 1 week after it was towed away from the city. Its parent company says it encountered adverse conditions in the South China Sea. The three-story eatery welcomed more than 30 million visitors during its 44 years, including the Queen and Tom Cruise. It was also featured in several films. In 2020, the restaurant was forced to cease operations because of the pandemic. Train workers off the job and commuters off track. Coming up, the consequences of Britain's biggest rail strike in decades. Plus, the disturbing allegations at a long-term care home in Winnipeg. The biggest rail strike in more than 30 years is causing widespread disruption all over the UK. Stations across the country are closed and thousands of scheduled trains have been cancelled after more than 40,000 rail workers walked off the job. The union is planning further walkouts for Thursday and Saturday. London's underground system is also behind picket lines in a separate pension dispute. Union leaders are warning these strikes could be just the beginning of a summer of labor strife, with airline employees, teachers, and several other sectors also threatening walkouts. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is on his way to Rwanda for a summit with Commonwealth leaders, the first such meeting since 2018. From there, Trudeau will travel to Germany to meet with G7 leaders before attending the NATO summit in Spain. Russia's war in Ukraine expected to dominate all three meetings. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken is traveling with the Prime Minister. David?
Well, Neetu, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is going to once again call on world leaders at all these summits to do whatever they can to get Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. But world leaders, including the Prime Minister, are also seized with one of the big problems caused by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine: global food insecurity.
MPs from all parties on the House of Commons Agriculture Committee understand the urgency of the issue and are already looking at ways Canada might help.
I think it's one of the most important questions that we all collectively in the world are facing.
Ukraine and Russia are two of the world's largest food producers. War has not only disrupted that production, but Russia is now actively targeting Ukraine's agricultural capacity and has destroyed some stores of grain at Black Sea ports.
And given the fact that Ukraine feeds about 400 million people every year, we know that the world is in trouble. We're going to run out of food.
But leaders at this trio of summits, the Commonwealth, the G7, and NATO, could struggle to meet that challenge.
The world is rather volatile, and economic conditions may make things difficult. Because if you're looking at a recession, there won't be quite as much money to hand around.
This is not just a 2022 problem. The consequences of the war are going to have reverberating impacts far beyond 2022.
And Trudeau may face difficult questions about what Canada is doing to help.
It is high time for Canadian farming or Canadian ag to really think differently about how to support the entire world when it comes to food security, because I don't think Canada's role has been all that significant.
Trudeau will touch down in the Rwandan capital of Kigali Wednesday afternoon, and he won't be back here in Ottawa until Canada Day. Neetu.
Thanks, David. Left to struggle. Ahead, where's the money Ottawa promised to support Canadians' mental health? Police in Manitoba are investigating multiple allegations of abuse by at least 2 workers at a personal care home in Winnipeg. The Winnipeg Regional Health Authority says the alleged abuse took place at the Oakview Place long-term care home and date back to February. Details haven't been released, but officials say 15 residents were involved. 2 healthcare aides have been put on paid leave as police conduct a criminal investigation. The federal Liberals are under fire over missing mental health spending, a marquee promise in the party's 2021 election platform. $4.5 billion was pledged over 5 years to help provinces improve access to mental health treatment. But almost a year since Trudeau said it was a priority, none of the money has materialized. Jamie Morocker has more.
5 years ago, Leanne Minicello's mental health deteriorated to the point where she worried she would lose custody of her daughter.
I was feeling terrible. I mean, I had suicidal thoughts and everything.
The now 45-year-old was diagnosed with ADHD and borderline personality disorder. Without provincially funded therapy, she's not sure she would be here.
I'm not the norm. I think about the children. I think about the parents and people who aren't able to get this help.
According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, the system is overwhelmed and wait lists are long.
We knew going into 2020 that the mental health system wasn't equipped to deal with the strain that was on it prior to the pandemic, and now has only become much worse.
Mental health should be a priority.
In August of last year, Justin Trudeau promised $4.5 billion to provinces and territories for the new mental health transfer, but no money, including the initial $875 million supposed to have been spent or budgeted by now, has materialized. Last week, the federal mental health and addictions minister faced tough questions about the promise.
The platform promised that money to have been spent right now, so that was a mistake.
There were concerns that the $5 billion in the bilateral agreements wasn't transparent and accountable for the money that was being spent.
In March, Ottawa announced $45 million to develop national standards to ensure that accountability. In an email to Global News, Bennett said they will formalize what Canadians can expect in terms of timeliness and quality of mental health services. But advocates say that's just a delay tactic.
Accommodations for people that need.
Diane Young lost her son to addiction and mental illness in 2013. 9 years later, she runs a not-for-profit treatment center in his name. Funding, she says, held her back for years.
It's frustrating, yes. It's sad, more than frustrating.
That the cost could continue to put Canadians' lives at risk. Jamie Morocker, Global News, Toronto.
Back in the U.S., COVID-19 vaccinations have finally started for many of its youngest Americans. The rollout begins after Pfizer and Moderna's shots, covering those aged between 6 months and 5 years, got federal approval late last week, allowing roughly 18 million kids to get protected from the virus. Though relatively rare for the age group, about 480 children below 5 have died of COVID-19 in the U.S. Honoring heritage and culture. Next, the celebrations across Canada on this National Indigenous Peoples Day. National Indigenous Peoples Day was front and center on Google Canada's main page today with a doodle celebrating an influential First Nations artist. In addition to a thunderbird and Anishinaabe florals, the illustration features the portrait of the late Norval Morrisseau, also known as Copper Thunderbird. Called the Picasso of the North, he was known for depicting traditional stories, spiritual themes, and political messages in his work. He also founded the woodland style that became popular among the Indigenous art community. The doodle itself was designed by First Nations couple Blake Anjakonib and Danielle Morrison. From coast to coast on First Nation, Métis, and Inuit territory, people gathered for traditional ceremonies to mark the occasion. And while Canada still has a long way to go on the path towards truth and reconciliation, Indigenous communities proudly shared their culture on this day of remembrance and celebration. Heather Yurex-West reports.
From Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton to the ancestral and unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people in Halifax, there were sounds of drumming and dancing as members of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities celebrated the country's 26th National Indigenous Peoples Day.
It's
wonderful to be able to show, all aspects of our cultures here on Turtle Island.
In Toronto, the day began with a sunrise ceremony at Nathan Phillips Square, where people gathered around a sacred fire to make offerings.
We embrace our relationships and, that beautiful road of reconciliation that we're walking today. We honor all of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. We also honor all the children who've been lost.
In Calgary, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Iskia Nakota, and Métis, the reconciliation walk to Fort Calgary was filled with hope.
With National Indigenous Peoples Day, it's a celebration of the goodness too that has gone on through the generations, not just the difficulties.
I've been feeling really positively in recent years. I'm seeing more people like me in the media. I'm feeling seen and represented, so that's been really amazing.
The discovery of unmarked graves near the sites of former residential schools across the country has prompted a national reckoning over Canada's treatment of Indigenous people. And while there is still a deep and collective trauma among Indigenous communities, there is also cause for great pride.
We have a very strong cultural and a robust community, and we contribute a lot. Indigenous people are 1.5 times more likely than mainstream society to be business owners and successful business owners.
One of the many reasons to celebrate the strength and resiliency of the people that first called this land home. Heather Urex West, Global News, Calgary.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday night. I'm Neetu Garsha. Whether it's BC, Quebec, or beyond, we'll leave you tonight with more scenes from across the country today, marking this 26th National Indigenous Peoples Day. Thanks for watching. I'll see you here again tomorrow. Have a great night.